All right, so today we're talking about HTML dialogues versus popovers. Now, HTML dialogues are very well supported. If we take a look at caniuse.com, we can see that the dialog element has 93.7% coverage. So all the major browsers have coverage for this. Popover was just added in the most recent version of Chrome and Edge. It's also in the technical preview for Safari. It's behind a flag on Firefox, and it should be coming very soon to Opera. So it's just supported now, but in the coming months, we should see this percentage climb quite a bit. So I want to talk about the differences between the two of them, how you can use both of them, and why you would choose one over the other. So we'll start with dialog. Now, a dialog is an actual HTML element. So here in my source code, here I'll bump this up a little bit in size. There we go. Here's an actual dialog element. So it's got an ID, give it a class name. There's nothing special about that in as much as you can add the same global attributes that you would with other elements. But what the dialog does do is it gives you the ability to create a modal dialog. That's the most important thing here. So a modal dialog is something that would appear above the screen. So it's going to be by default centered in the middle of the screen. It's going to have a backdrop behind it, so an overlay over the rest of the screen. So the rest of the screen is going to look a little bit faded out. We're going to have this dialog that appears in the middle, and you can put all kinds of HTML inside there. So you could have a form, having the user fill something out. You could do a little survey, a pop-up, a poll, anything like that. So when you want the user to interact with this thing, that's the key with a dialog is, here's some information. I want you to definitely interact. You as the user need to interact with this thing. Now, I've got a button here for showing my dialog, and that's another difference of the dialog. Because we want the user interaction, so there's going to be something in JavaScript that opens the dialog, and then the user has to do something to make the dialog close. I'm going to use a button click. So I've got a button inside my dialog that's going to make it disappear. So let's jump right into the code here. My script is being loaded with type module, which means it's going to be the same basically as using the defer attribute. It won't run until after the HTML has all loaded, even though my script tag is up in the head. So inside of here, what I want to do is I want to add my listeners. So I'm going to add listeners for my buttons. I'm going to start with just the one. So we're going to do this one, the show dialog. So we'll give it an ID. We'll say btnd. And I'll call this one btnp for popover. There we go. And over in here, document get element by ID, btnd. Okay, so that's my dialog. When I click it, I'm going to call this function. I'll say open dialog. So we need to create that function. There's my click event. And inside of here, we need to get a reference to the dialog that we want to open. So dialog1, that's the ID. That is going to be our dialog. So we'll put that into a variable here. I'll just call it dialog. And the methods are actually quite simple. So we've got a show method. Not shadow root, but show. This is going to display a dialog, but the dialog that it's going to load is not going to be a modal one. So it's going to be really pretty close to what a popover is. So we're going to use show modal because that's the most useful version of a dialog. Here we go. We click on our button, and there it is. This is the dialog. And the page looks a little bit grayed here. Now there is some default styling that comes along with a dialog element and its backdrop. In the CSS file here that I've given you, down at the bottom, I've got a whole bunch of stuff for the default styles. And this backdrop right here, this is what you get for this area right here outside of the dialog. So position fixed, inset 0, and a background with 10% opacity. So it's covering everything with a 10% opacity. Now we can put our own in here. We can say anytime there is a backdrop belonging to a dialog, this is what I want to have. So I will leave all of the other default things, but I'm going to add my own styling for the backdrop. Maybe there's colors that I'm using as part of my color scheme for my website that I want to use in here. So we'll say 50%, 50%, and let's use 30% as the color. And there we go. Now we've got this kind of lavender color. You can still see the content in behind. We could make that 90%. There we go. Really show that, yes, there is actually this overlay. So you're probably going to have overlays. You're going to want overlays with a much higher level of opacity, like not the 10% default, but something higher than that to really draw attention to the dialog. Now, as I was saying before, with the dialog, we want the user to be able to interact with it. We want them to interact with it, so they have to click this. Kind of like an alert dialog, the window.alert method that pops up that built-in one. We want something like that. So this dialog pops up and the user has to click to dismiss. There's no way around it. With a modal dialog, it means I can't click these other buttons. I can't interact with the rest of the page. That's the whole point of a modal, is that it's something on a layer above the website. So there's this backdrop layer. It's this invisible window between the rest of the page and the dialog. So the person can't do anything except interact with this thing. So I need to be able to get rid of my dialog. Right now, I can click anywhere here on this. Nothing happens. This is what a popover will do. A popover, you can actually, you get this light dismiss. So I can click anywhere. As long as it's not on the popover itself, I can click anywhere on the page and it will disappear. With a modal, we do have to tell it we intentionally want it to disappear. So let's get the button that's inside there, my button inside of the dialog. And I think I use class button close. Yeah, there we go. All right, so that is the button, and then we'll add the listener for the click event to say we want to close the dialog. So inside of here, we will just say dialog.close. Not closest, but close. There we go. That right there is all you need. So show the dialog, close the dialog. That's it. Show modal to open it and get the overlay and prevent the user from interacting with the rest of the page until they've dealt with the modal. And then dialog close will make it disappear. Now we do have event listeners as well. There's a close event. So if you want, on your dialog, you can add an event listener for the close event to have something happen. You can listen for the cancel event, which is another one here. So if I click show dialog, if I hit the escape key, so I'm not moving the mouse at all, I just hit the escape key, that is like canceling out of the dialog. So I haven't clicked the button, but I've made the dialog go away just by hitting the escape key. So what would I do with the close function? Why would I want to have a close listener? I mean, the user has clicked on it. I had the click listener. I know when they did this. So what is the point of having a close listener? Well, with a dialog, like I was saying before, you could have the user doing something like filling out a form. If that's the case, we are allowed to have a return value in here. So I have a return value for this. You know, it could be the number 123. It doesn't really matter what the value is. I can put a JavaScript array or an object. They fill out a form. I take that data. Here, I'm passing it back to the page, but I'm not doing anything with it. If I were to add a listener to my dialog for the close event, we could do it just right inside here. We can say dialog add event listener, listening for the close, not the click. So we can console log that, see what we're getting. And let's open up the console here. Okay, so show the dialog, close the dialog, and here we have it. So we've triggered the close event. Here is the close event itself. Like all events, we have a target. The target for this is going to be the dialog itself. So we don't, in this event, we do not have the return value here. But instead of doing this, let's say D for dialog, ev.target. That is the dialog object itself. And we have a property called return value built into the dialog. That is one of its two properties that it has. The dialog element has two properties, return value being one of them. So if I show and close, there it is, 1, 2, 3. That is the return value coming back from our dialog. And like I said, this can be anything you want. It's only one value, but it can be any type of data you want. It could be an object, it could be an array, it could be Boolean, string, whatever. So we have this one property called return value. The other property is called open. And it is a Boolean saying whether or not the dialog is currently open. So d.open. Over here, show the dialog, close the dialog, and there it is, false. It is not currently open. We had the close event. It's gone. Now, there is an attribute that you can add called open as well. So there's a matching one here. If you add open inside of the HTML, this is what you get. You get the dialog open when the page loads, or if you're dynamically building the dialog with JavaScript, if you give it the open attribute like this, it will be open on the page. Now note, I don't have the background here. And that is sort of the same thing that happens if we go in here, if we go show, instead of show modal, there. So this is what's happening. If you add the open attribute, you're showing the dialog, but it's not a modal. I can still interact with the page here. Close the dialog, it still works, but that's the difference. So show modal, that's the one you're probably going to want to have. Close to get rid of it, regardless of what kind it is, show modal or show. But show modal is the one you're probably going to want, and then this return value, if you want it, it's on the return value property for the dialog. And there we go, that's dialogs. So popovers. Popovers are not an HTML element in themselves. You can use any HTML you want and turn it into a popover. Popover is actually an API. It's an HTML5 API called the Popover API. Now inside of here, I've got a div, gave it an ID, gave it a class. I just have to give it this attribute. So I can take a paragraph or a div, a span, whatever I want, and give it this attribute. That's what makes it into a popover. So I want to be able to show the popover. Okay, fine. We can do the same sort of thing that we were doing with the dialog by showing it, but my button right here, to connect it to this thing, I want this ID, and inside of here, I'm going to say my popover target. If I spell it correctly, there we go, is that. This ID is what connects this button to this popover. So I save that now, show the popover, I click on this, and there it is. There's my popover with the overlay, using the same backdrop CSS that we had before. So the popover does the same sort of thing. The difference is I didn't have to write any JavaScript for this. I simply had to take an HTML element, say that it's popover, which means by default it's not going to be shown. I find a button and I give it the popover target and give it the ID of the element that I want to show. Now, the light dismiss that I was referring to earlier, because I don't have any JavaScript here. Just there it is. But if I click anywhere on the page, it's gone. So show the popover, click away. Show the popover, click away. So it's like having an information message. You want to show something on the screen. Now we can use JavaScript to dismiss it. Like we can set a timer and say that, hey, I want to get rid of this thing. There's a show method. There is a show popover, hide popover, and toggle popover. Those are the three methods that we have. So if I get a reference to this div in my JavaScript, I can call one of those three methods: toggle popover, hide popover, show popover. So if you want to have it displayed, triggered by some other thing other than clicking on a button, you can do that. You do not have to have a button on the page that you click. The show dialog, you should be using an input or a button and then target it that way. But for the popover target is all you need to do to show it if you are using a button or an input to do that. Now there is one other attribute here, the popover target, and you can do all in lowercase, target action. Now inside of here, the default is to toggle. So I click it and I'm clicking again, but you can say that this is only for showing it. So the purpose of this button is just to show it. Clicking on the button again does nothing, but I can click someplace else to dismiss it. So show it, click somewhere else to dismiss. We can say its purpose is to hide. So I can have one button for showing, one for hiding. So here's the one for hiding. So if I click on that, nothing's happening. I'm not showing the popover because the target action is set to hide. Or the default toggle, meaning when I click on it, yeah, I'm showing and hiding, going back and forth between the two of them. Now the popover is not a modal, which means I can still interact with the rest of the page. Even though that overlay is there, it's not stopping my click events. I can still click on the button that's below. Now, going into the JavaScript with this popover right here, this div that has the popover attribute, this ID, if I come in here and I add event listeners to it, I don't need it for the button because the button is already connected to it through the attribute. But if we go in here with the popover, I can add event listeners, and there's two events that we can add to a popover. And toggle and before toggle. Those are the two events. And I will have to actually add the two functions in here. And we'll just throw a console.log here. Now, toggle is show or hide. So I click on the button here, toggled. There we go. We've shown the dialog. Click it again. Click it to show, click someplace to dismiss, and it shows up. So it is doing that toggle event listener function every single time it shows or it hides. But it's important to note that this is happening once that's done. So I have shown it, I have hidden it, I have shown it, I have hidden it. I've finished doing that. If there's any sort of actions that you need to do before the dialog disappears, sorry, not the dialog, the popover disappears, that's what the before toggle event is for. So if we add that, I guess I'll capitalize it the other way. There we are. So before toggled, there we go. Before toggled happens first, then the toggle. So this is before it appears. This is after it has appeared. And when I click again, same order again. This is before it disappeared, and this is after it has disappeared. So we have those two events that we can listen for, toggle and before toggle. With the dialogues, there's close and cancel, so hitting the escape key. And that's pretty much it. That's the difference between the two of them. So pretty soon we're going to have the Popover available through all the major browsers. Right now, Dialog is available through all the major browsers, but Dialog works best as a modal. So as something that creates this layer over top, and the user is forced to interact with this thing. Whether it's, they hit the escape key, they still had to take some action. They can't just ignore the fact that you've displayed this message. So you don't want this for every single thing that the person does. You don't want to be showing them a modal dialogue just saying, okay, yeah, thank you for filling in the form and clicking the save button, and then saying, okay, successfully saved. You don't want the person to have to click OK that they have successfully saved something. You want them to just, okay, thanks. I see the little message that appeared that said that, yes, you have shown this thing. Now, just another note here. So the default styles that are applied to these things, we talked about the backdrop. Popover open is a pseudo class. So when the popover is showing, this is the pseudo class that applies. So if you want specific styling to the popover when it's open, here's one that is a popover, which is not open, and it's not a dialog that is opened. So that is the default styling that is being applied to a popover that is not currently being shown. Here's the default for popovers for everything. So position fixed. It will wrap the content that you've got. Whatever the canvas text color is, that's what it's going to use. So this is your default styles for the page will be used for the colors. Inset 0. So basically it's going to take this, but it's going to stay within the size of the page. Margin auto, so it will center it. And border padding overflow. All the basic stuff. So this is an attribute selector, if you haven't seen those before, with the square brackets. And it refers to this thing right here, this attribute. If that attribute exists, we're styling everything with that attribute right here. And then we've got another one here. If it's open, what is the backdrop for the popover? So we had one up here that was just backdrop that was applying to all the backdrops. But you could, if you wanted, say, oh yeah, I've got my CSS class dialog. So this is the backdrop for dialogs. But for the popovers, the backdrop that I'm going to use, not background, but backdrop that I'm going to use, I'm going to do something completely different. You know, maybe this one's going to be red with 5% and 95% opacity, lightness, and 10%. So it's more like a very faint pink for the popover. So the dialog has the purple, but popover, you can barely see it on my screen. If you watch the buttons, you'll see there's a very slight change that happens because I've got this very faint one for the backdrop. All right, so we have those, and I've also added a file here. So all the code from this video is linked to down in the description. There's a code gist with all these files. And I have notes here about dialogues, all the HTML, the JavaScript properties, the methods, the events, and for popovers, everything there. So this is a reference for all of that for you, just inside that code gist that you can use as a reference. And as always, thanks for watching.